Picture a thriving medieval town, children playing in cobblestone streets, merchants calling their wares at bustling markets, families gathering around warm hearths as evening shadows danced on ancient walls. This community vanished so completely from history that even its name disappeared from maps. Today, it exists only as a whisper in the wind, a story that reveals something profound about human resilience when everything familiar crumbles away. This town's disappearance wasn't caused by war, earthquake, or fire, but by something far more insidious. Something that crept through medieval streets like a silent predator, turning neighbor against neighbor, reducing a vibrant community to empty shells of stone and timber in mere months. Yet within this darkness, ordinary people discovered extraordinary strength. Welcome to our cozy corner of history, where we'll explore one of the most haunting tales of resilience ever recorded. Tonight, we journey to the 14th century, to a time when the very air seemed poisoned with fear, when a single breath could determine life or death, and when communities discovered what they were truly capable of surviving. The plague, the Black Death. These words still send shivers down our spines, even centuries later. But beyond the statistics and the sweeping historical narratives lies a more intimate story. The story of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, of communities that discovered what it truly meant to endure when everything familiar crumbled away. Picture yourself walking through a typical European town in the year 1347. The morning air carries the scent of fresh bread from the baker's ovens, mixed with the earthy aroma of horses and hay from the stables. Children dart between market stalls, their laughter echoing off the narrow walls of tightly packed houses. Merchants call out their prices in sing-song voices, competing for the attention of housewives clutching worn leather purses. This was a world where life moved at the pace of the seasons, where most people never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace, and where the rhythm of daily existence had remained unchanged for generations. The plague was something that happened in distant lands, a calamity that befell other people in other places. It was as remote as dragons or unicorns, existing only in the fearful whispers of traveling merchants who spoke of cities far to the east where death walked freely through the streets. But plague, you see, is a patient traveler. It doesn't announce its arrival with trumpets or banners. It slips quietly into communities, hiding in the holds of merchant ships, nestled in the fur of rats, carried in the breath of seemingly healthy visitors who've journeyed from distant ports. It spreads like ripples in a pond, each infected person becoming a new center of devastation, reaching out to touch everyone around them. The vulnerability of these medieval towns wasn't just biological. It was woven into the very fabric of their existence. Houses stood so close together that neighbors could pass items from window to window. Families crowded into single rooms, sharing beds, meals, and the very air they breathed. Water came from communal wells, food from shared markets, and news from communal gatherings where everyone pressed close to hear the latest tales from far-off lands. In this world of intimate community bonds, hygiene was a luxury few could afford. People bathed rarely, if at all. Garbage piled in the streets, providing feast for the rats that scurried freely between homes and shops. Chamber pots were emptied into narrow alleys, and the wealthy practice of changing linens regularly was unheard of among common folk. The very closeness that made these communities so warm and supportive also made them perfect breeding grounds for disease. But it wasn't just the physical conditions that made these towns vulnerable. The medieval mind understood illness differently than we do today. Disease was often seen as divine punishment for sin, or as the result of corrupted air, or as the influence of unfortunate planetary alignments. The idea that tiny, invisible creatures could cause such devastation was as foreign as suggesting that thoughts could kill or that words could heal. When someone fell ill in these communities, the natural response was to gather close, to provide comfort and care. Families huddled around sick beds, offering what little medicine they possessed. Herbal teas, poultices, prayers whispered in the flickering candlelight. Friends visited to offer support and solidarity. Priests arrived to provide last rites, moving from house to house, touching the sick and dying with hands that unknowingly carried death to the next household. Every act of love, every gesture of compassion, every moment of human connection potentially carried the seeds of catastrophe. Yet imagine the profound courage this required, choosing love despite the risk, offering comfort knowing it might mean sacrifice. In these impossible choices, something beautiful about human nature revealed itself. Yet in our forgotten town, life continued with an almost heartbreaking normalcy, even as the first shadows of disaster began to fall. The baker still rose before dawn to knead his dough. The blacksmith's hammer still rang against iron in the early morning hours. Children still played their ancient games in the streets. and lovers still met in secret corners to exchange whispered promises. There's something profoundly moving about this normalcy in the face of approaching doom. These weren't people living in constant terror. They were simply living their lives, tending to their families, pursuing their trades, planning for futures they believed would unfold much like their past. The plague hadn't yet revealed itself as the destroyer of worlds. It was still just another hardship in lives already acquainted with difficulty. Winter was always a season of particular hardship in medieval communities. Food stores dwindled, fuel became precious, and the cold crept through every crack and crevice of poorly insulated homes. People huddled closer together for warmth, sharing their breath, their space, their very life force. It was during these intimate winter months that the plague found its most fertile ground, spreading from person to person with devastating efficiency. Imagine a cozy hearth, crackling softly as snow falls outside, casting dancing shadows on the faces of a family gathered for their evening meal. The father speaks of his work at the mill, the mother shares news from the market, and the children listen with bright eyes as grandmother tells an old story about brave knights and magical forests. This scene of domestic tranquility, repeated in countless homes throughout our forgotten town, represents both the height of human comfort and the perfect conditions for an approaching catastrophe. The genuine fear for survival that would soon grip these communities was still weeks away. For now, there was only the ordinary struggle of making it through another winter, of keeping the fire burning and the food stores from running out before spring arrived. These were people of remarkable resilience, accustomed to hardship, skilled at finding joy in small things, and possessed of an unbreakable human spirit that had carried them through generations of difficulty. But what happened next would test that spirit in ways no previous generation had ever imagined. The forgotten town that we're exploring tonight would face a trial that would strip away everything familiar, everything comfortable, everything that had defined their world for centuries. And in that stripping away, something extraordinary would emerge. A testament to what people can endure when they have no choice but to endure, and to what they can become when everything they thought they knew about life and death is turned upside down. But what happened next changed everything forever. The collapse began quietly, like winter's first breath on autumn leaves. Imagine, if you will, the morning when Thomas awoke to find the marketplace eerily silent. No merchants calling their wares, no children darting between stalls, no familiar bustle that had defined his small English town for generations. Just the hollow echo of his footsteps on cobblestones that seemed suddenly too wide, too empty. This was not the dramatic collapse you might picture from stories of war or natural disaster. This was something far more insidious, far more terrifying in its gradual certainty. The Great Mortality, as they would come to call it, didn't announce itself with trumpets or flames. It crept into communities like fog rolling in from distant shores, changing everything it touched while leaving the landscape deceptively familiar. Picture yourself standing in that marketplace with Thomas that morning. The wooden stalls still stood where they always had, their weathered surfaces bearing the marks of countless transactions. The stone fountain in the center still trickled with clear water from the nearby spring. Even the church bells rang out the hour, their bronze voices carrying across rooftops as they had for centuries. Yet something fundamental had shifted, something that would never return to what it was. The first signs had appeared weeks earlier, though few recognized them for what they truly were. Master William, the cloth merchant who controlled the wool trade through 3 counties, had failed to arrive for the autumn fair. His absence created a ripple that spread outward like stones thrown into still water. Without his goods, the smaller traders who depended on his business found themselves with nothing to sell. Without buyers for their produce, farmers began to question whether the long journey to market was worth the effort. But it wasn't just commerce that faltered in those early days. The very foundations of medieval life began to show their fragility. Consider how intricate the web of relationships was in a town of merely 800 souls. Everyone knew everyone, and everyone depended on everyone else in ways both obvious and hidden. Picture yourself walking through such a close-knit community on a peaceful morning. Children calling out greetings to shopkeepers who had watched them grow, neighbors sharing news over garden fences. The comfortable rhythm of interdependence that had sustained them through countless seasons. When the baker's son fell ill and could no longer help with the dawn bread, it meant late deliveries to households throughout the community. When the blacksmith's wife succumbed to the fever and he spent his days nursing her rather than tending his forge, it meant plows went unrepaired and horses went unshod. These weren't merely inconveniences, they were the first threads being pulled from a tapestry that had taken generations to weave. Each absence created a gap that others scrambled to fill. But there were only so many hands, only so many hours in each day. The rhythm of life that had seemed as natural and unchanging as the seasons themselves began to stutter and strain. Thomas had built his life around predictability. As the town's grain merchant, he knew that harvest would come in September, that the mill would grind through October, that winter stores would be laid in by November's end. He knew which farmers could be trusted to deliver quality wheat, which households would need credit until spring, which roads would become impassable when the rains came. This knowledge was his livelihood, his security, his place in the world. Now, as he walked through that silent marketplace, Thomas felt the ground shifting beneath everything he had believed to be solid. 3 of his most reliable suppliers had not arrived for the weekly market. The miller, old Geoffrey, had sent word that his apprentice was too ill to work the wheel, and without help, he could not process the grain that farmers desperately needed ground into flour. The roads that connected his town to the wider world, those vital arteries of trade and communication, seemed to be growing longer and more dangerous with each passing day. What Thomas couldn't yet understand was that his small-town struggles were being repeated in countless communities across England, across France, across the entire known world. The plague had not yet arrived in its full, terrible manifestation, but its shadow had already begun to fall. Ships that should have carried goods between ports instead sat empty at anchor, their crews either dead or fled. Monasteries that had served as centers of learning and charity for centuries found themselves struggling to tend their own sick and dying. Even the great trade routes that connected east to west, those highways of prosperity that had enriched nations and built empires, were beginning to fragment as fear overcame profit. In the countryside surrounding Thomas's town, the situation was becoming even more precarious. Imagine young Margaret, barely 16, suddenly finding herself responsible for her family's farm, when the fever took both her father and eldest brother within the span of a single week. She had watched them work the land all her life, but watching and doing were vastly different things. The barley needed harvesting, but she lacked the strength to swing the heavy scythe for hours at a time. The pigs needed feeding, but without her brother's strong back to carry the heavy buckets, the task seemed impossible. Most crucially, the seed grain for next year's planting needed to be carefully selected and stored, but she had never learned which kernels showed the most promise, which would survive a harsh winter, which would produce the strongest crops. Margaret's story was not unique. Across the region, farms that had fed communities for generations were falling into disrepair, not because the land itself had failed, but because the knowledge and labor needed to work, it had suddenly vanished. The careful balance between human effort and natural abundance, refined over centuries of trial and error, was collapsing in a matter of weeks. The consequences rippled outward in ways both immediate and profound. When Margaret's farm could not produce its usual yield, it meant less grain for Thomas to purchase and distribute. When similar failures occurred on neighboring farms, it meant the mill had less work. The baker had fewer customers. The tavern served fewer travelers. The circular economy that had sustained the community for generations was becoming a spiral of decline. Yet perhaps most troubling of all was how quickly people began to lose faith in the institutions that had anchored their world. The church, which had promised protection and meaning in exchange for devotion and tithes, seemed powerless against an enemy it could neither explain nor combat. Local lords, who had claimed authority in exchange for protection, found their own households decimated and their ability to maintain order severely compromised. Even the guilds, those brotherhoods of craftsmen who had regulated trade and maintained standards for centuries, discovered that their carefully guarded secrets meant nothing when there was no one left to pass them on to. Thomas found himself questioning assumptions he had never thought to examine. If God was truly watching over the faithful, why were the most devout households suffering alongside the wicked? If the social order was divinely appointed, why did death seem to claim lord and peasant with equal indifference? If human knowledge and experience were truly valuable, why did they seem so useless against this invisible enemy? These were dangerous thoughts in a world where questioning authority could mean excommunication or worse. But when the very foundations of existence were crumbling, such questions became unavoidable. In the quiet of his empty shop, surrounded by grain sacks that would likely never be filled again, Thomas began to understand that the world he had inherited from his father would not be the world he left to his children. The truly terrifying aspect of those early days was not just what was happening, but what was not happening. Letters stopped arriving from neighboring towns. Peddlers ceased their regular routes. Pilgrims no longer passed through on their way to distant shrines. The flow of information that had connected communities across vast distances simply dried up, leaving each settlement to face its crisis in isolation, uncertain whether their suffering was unique or universal. Picture the strange silence that settled over familiar roads. Paths that had once hummed with the gentle rhythm of commerce and connection, now lying empty under pale winter sky. Yet in this isolation, communities discovered new depths of their own resilience, learning to find strength within themselves. In this growing silence, rumor became more powerful than fact. Word spread that the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins, though no one could agree on which particular transgressions had triggered such wrath. Some claimed it was a poison in the air itself, while others insisted it spread through contact with the afflicted. A few whispered that it was sorcery, the work of enemies both foreign and domestic. Without reliable information, fear filled the void, and fear made decisions that logic might have questioned. As Thomas locked his shop that evening, the key turning with a finality that seemed to echo through the empty streets, he could not have imagined that this was merely the beginning. The first collapse, devastating as it seemed, was only the gentlest introduction to the catastrophe that was still approaching. The infrastructure of trade and agriculture, of governance and community had begun to fracture. The bonds that held society together were stretching and snapping one by one. But here's what's truly remarkable about human nature. Just when everything seemed lost, something unexpected was about to emerge. The worst was still to come in the second wave, when the plague would arrive not as a whisper, but as a roar. When the carefully maintained illusion that human civilization was stronger than the forces of nature would be shattered completely. The foundation had cracked, but the true test of everything humanity had built over centuries of struggle and progress was yet to begin. The second wave brought unexpected unity to what had once seemed like an ending. Imagine, if you will, walking through neighborhoods where the familiar sounds of isolation had been replaced by something entirely different. The gentle murmur of voices carrying across quiet streets, the soft scraping of shovels working together, the warm glow of shared fires visible through windows that had remained dark for so long. It was in these moments of deepest uncertainty that something remarkable began to emerge from the shadows of our collective fear. Picture Sarah, a retired teacher who had spent months avoiding her neighbors, now standing at her kitchen window watching as the young father from 3 houses down struggled to clear the growing debris from his driveway. Without a word, she pulled on her coat and walked outside, carrying a thermos of hot coffee and an extra pair of work gloves. This scene was playing out across countless communities, dear listener, as people discovered that survival wasn't just about enduring alone anymore. It was about recognizing that the barriers we had built between ourselves, those invisible walls of modern convenience and digital connection, had become luxuries we could no longer afford. The winter that followed the second wave was a season of genuine transformation. Feel the shift in the air as neighbors who had lived side by side for years finally learned each other's names. Maria, who had always hurried past with her headphones on, now found herself lingering by garden fences, sharing stories about her grandmother's recipes with Mrs. Chen, whose own tales of growing up during wartime carried wisdom that suddenly felt essential rather than quaint. Picture the gentle beauty of these first connections. 2 women discovering friendship across a garden fence, their voices soft in the morning air as they shared memories and dreams. In these simple moments, communities began to remember what they had been missing all along. There was something profound happening in these small exchanges. Something that spoke to the unbreakable human spirit that emerges when circumstance strips away everything except what truly matters. The corner store that had always been just a quick transaction became a gathering place where people lingered, where the elderly Mr. Thompson began teaching younger neighbors how to preserve food without electricity, his weathered hands demonstrating techniques his own father had shown him decades before. Picture these quiet revolutions happening in garages transformed into community workshops, where the sound of hammering and sawing mixed with laughter and the sharing of stories. James, a software engineer who had spent years staring at screens, discovered he had a gift for fixing things, his patient explanations helping single mothers learn to repair bicycles and patch roofs. The genuine fear for survival that had initially driven people apart was now weaving them together in ways that felt both ancient and revolutionary. Imagine sitting by your own window on one of those crisp evenings, watching as children who had once been confined to their separate yards now moved freely between houses, carrying messages and small gifts, their voices creating a symphony of connection that filled the spaces where car engines and air conditioners once hummed. The cozy warmth of shared resources began to replace the cold anxiety of individual struggle. It was in these moments that people rediscovered the forgotten art of true community. The book club that had been meeting virtually for months finally gathered in person, crowding into living rooms where the soft flicker of candles replaced harsh overhead lighting. They read by the gentle glow, sharing not just stories from pages but stories from their own lives, creating new chapters together in the quiet revolution that was reshaping their understanding of what it meant to belong. The elderly Agnes, who had been surviving on canned soup and the occasional delivery, found herself at the center of a network of care that seemed to appear organically. Young families brought her fresh bread and stayed to listen to her stories of growing up during the Great Depression, their children sitting cross-legged on her worn carpet, absorbing lessons about resilience that no textbook could teach. Feel the warmth of these connections as they spread like gentle ripples across communities that had forgotten how to truly see each other. The hardware store owner began offering free classes on basic repairs. His dusty backroom transformed into a place where knowledge flowed freely between generations. The yoga instructor moved her classes to the park, teaching stress relief techniques under trees that had witnessed countless seasons of human adaptation. There was beauty in watching people discover skills they never knew they possessed. The accountant who learned to can vegetables, the lawyer who became expert at starting fires without matches, the retired nurse who organized informal first aid workshops in her backyard. Each person contributing their unique gifts to a tapestry of mutual support that grew stronger with every shared meal and every problem solved together. Picture the evening gatherings that began spontaneously in driveways and front yards, where the soft hum of conversation replaced the electronic buzz of separate entertainments. Children learned games that required nothing but imagination and willing playmates, while adults discovered the profound satisfaction of work done with hands and hearts, rather than keyboards and screens. The transformation wasn't without its challenges, dear listener. There were moments when old habits of privacy and self-reliance clashed with the new reality of interdependence. But gradually, people learned to navigate these tensions with the same patience they were applying to all the other adjustments in their lives. Imagine the first community garden that sprouted in what had been an empty lot, neighbors working side by side to turn hard earth into rows of possibility. The architect who designed rain collection systems, the mechanic who taught others to maintain hand tools, the grandmother who showed young parents how to preserve the harvest for winter months ahead. These weren't just practical exchanges, but acts of faith in a shared future. Each seed planted, each skill shared, each moment of laughter echoing between houses represented a choice to believe in something larger than individual survival. The community was becoming something more resilient than the sum of its parts. Something that could weather not just the immediate crisis, but whatever storms might follow. As spring approached with its promise of renewal, these bonds had grown deep roots. The networks of care and cooperation that had begun as desperate measures for survival were revealing themselves as something far more precious, something that perhaps had always been missing from their lives without them realizing it. The children who had learned to play together across yard boundaries, the neighbors who had discovered friendship in shared work, the elderly who found purpose in teaching, and the young who found wisdom in listening. All were creating something new from something very old. They were remembering what communities had always known, that true strength comes not from isolation, but from the countless threads of connection that bind us together. Yet as winter deepened and resources dwindled, this newfound unity would face its greatest test. When food ran out, choices became impossible. Picture, if you will, families gathered around empty tables, children looking up with questioning eyes, their usual bedtime stories replaced by the harsh reality of survival. This was the moment when the true test of community bonds would reveal something darker, more complex than anyone had anticipated. Sarah Martinez stared at the small pantry in her apartment, counting and recounting the same 3 cans of soup, half a bag of rice, and a box of crackers. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, had knocked earlier, asking if she had any extra food for her diabetic husband. Through the thin walls, Sarah could hear little Tommy upstairs crying from hunger. She held those 3 cans like they were made of gold, knowing they represented perhaps 4 more days for her own 2 children. Imagine the weight of such a decision. In normal times, sharing comes naturally, doesn't it? But when survival hangs in the balance, when every morsel could mean the difference between your child eating tonight or going to bed hungry, the calculus becomes impossibly cruel. This was happening in apartment buildings, suburban neighborhoods, and rural communities across the affected regions. The mathematical brutality of scarcity was transforming ordinary people into desperate philosophers, forced to answer questions they'd never imagined facing. Do you save your family first, or do you share with the community? Is it moral to hoard when others are starving? Where's the line between self-preservation and selfishness? Dr. James Fletcher, an emergency coordinator who lived through these weeks, later described the phenomenon as the great moral sorting. He watched as some households became fortresses, windows covered, doors barricaded, families existing in fearful isolation. Others opened their doors wide, pooling resources in an act of radical trust. Most fell somewhere in between, navigating a treacherous middle ground where every decision carried the weight of survival. The Henderson family chose the fortress approach. Tom Henderson, a usually generous man who coached Little League on weekends, had converted his garage into a food storage bunker. His wife Janet would peek through the curtains as neighbors walked by, her heart breaking with every hungry face she saw. But Tom had done the math, calculated down to the last calorie what his family of 5 would need to survive until help arrived. He couldn't save everyone, he reasoned, but he could save his own. 3 houses down, Maria Santos made the opposite choice. A single mother with 2 teenagers, she gathered what little food she had and created a community kitchen in her living room. Neighbors would come with whatever they could contribute. A bag of flour, some canned tomatoes, yesterday's bread. Together, they would create meals that stretched further than any individual household could manage alone. Her teenagers would go to bed hungry some nights, but surrounded by a dozen other families who shared the same sacrifice. Picture these 2 scenes existing on the same street, almost within sight of each other. The Hendersons eating their carefully rationed meals in silence. Curtains drawn, calculating how many days remained. The Santos house glowing with lamplight and conversation. Adults sharing cooking duties while children played together. Everyone thinner, but no one alone. Imagine the soft warmth radiating from that second home. The gentle murmur of voices, the quiet laughter of children at play, the comfort of shared purpose. Even in scarcity, love found a way to multiply rather than divide. Both families were making rational choices based on the same information. Both were trying to protect what they held most dear. And yet, their approaches represented fundamentally different philosophies about human nature and survival. The psychological toll was immense. Children began to learn concepts they shouldn't have to understand. 8-year-old Emma Thompson asked her mother why they couldn't share their hidden food stash with the family next door whose baby was crying all night from hunger. How do you explain to a child that sometimes being good means letting others suffer? How do you maintain a moral compass when the very concept of morality seems to shift with each empty stomach? Imagine holding such a conversation by gentle lamplight, trying to preserve a child's innocence while teaching them about a world that had suddenly become impossibly complex. These quiet moments of parental love, even in the darkest times, remind us of the unbreakable bonds that keep humanity whole. Some communities tried to implement formal rationing systems. Neighborhood councils formed overnight, attempting to create fair distribution networks. How do you explain to a child that sometimes being good means letting others suffer? But fairness itself became a source of conflict. Should a family of 6 receive more than a childless couple? What about elderly residents who needed special diets? Should those who had been more prepared beforehand be expected to share with those who hadn't planned ahead? The Riverside neighborhood attempted such a system. They established a central distribution point in the community center, with volunteer coordinators managing supplies and allocation. For 3 days it worked beautifully. Families would arrive with their contributions and leave with their allotments. Children played together while adults organized and planned. Then someone discovered that the Morrison family had been hiding additional supplies at home while still receiving their full allocation from the community pool. The trust that had held the system together cracked instantly. Arguments erupted about fairness, about punishment, about whether they should expel the Morrisons from the program entirely. The community kitchen closed that night, and neighbors returned to their individual survival calculations. These moral dilemmas weren't limited to food. Medical supplies became another source of agonizing choices. When insulin was scarce, who decided which diabetic received treatment? When there was 1 dose of heart medication left at the pharmacy, how did they choose between 2 cardiac patients? Some communities created lottery systems. Others established priority based on age or family status. Each system created its own moral complexities and painful consequences. The stories from this period reveal something profound about human nature under extreme stress. Dr. Patricia Williams, a sociologist who later studied these communities, found that the divisions weren't random. They followed patterns that revealed deep-seated beliefs about fairness, community, and survival that people hadn't even known they held. Picture these discoveries unfolding like layers of an ancient tapestry, each thread of human choice revealing deeper truths about what we value when everything familiar falls away. In this revelation lay both the pain of human complexity and the comfort of understanding ourselves more deeply. Some families discovered they were natural collectivists, finding strength and meaning in shared sacrifice. Others found they were individualists at heart, feeling most secure when they controlled their own resources. Neither approach was inherently right or wrong, but the stress of crisis forced people to discover which philosophy lived in their bones. The children, perhaps most tellingly, adapted to whatever system their families chose. In hoarding households, children learned to be secretive, to eat quietly, to never mention food around friends. In sharing communities, children learned different lessons about cooperation and collective responsibility. Both groups were learning survival skills, but they were fundamentally different kinds of survival. As the crisis deepened and the days stretched on, something unexpected began to emerge. The rigid categories of hoarders and sharers started to blur. Some fortress families reached their breaking point and opened their doors. Some sharing communities had to make the painful decision to exclude members who were taking advantage of others' generosity. The moral landscape shifted like sand beneath their feet. Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman with the diabetic husband, became a bridge between these worlds. Too proud to beg but too desperate to remain silent, she began offering services in exchange for food. She would mend clothes, watch children, clean houses, anything to earn a meal for her husband without feeling like charity. Her approach created a middle path that many families began to follow, establishing informal economies where dignity could be preserved even as resources were shared. These microeconomies revealed another dimension of the moral crisis. When money became meaningless and traditional jobs disappeared, how did people determine value? A teacher might trade lessons for bread. A mechanic might fix bicycles for soup. A grandmother's storytelling abilities became currency when parents needed someone to comfort frightened children. Imagine the gentle beauty of this transformation. A world where a grandmother's voice, soft and patient in the evening light, becomes as precious as gold. Where knowledge shared becomes nourishment, and kindness offered becomes the foundation of a new kind of wealth. But even these solutions carried moral weight. Was it fair for those with valuable skills to eat better than those whose talents were less immediately useful? Should an artist receive the same food allocation as a doctor? These questions forced communities to confront fundamental assumptions about worth, contribution, and human value. As week 3 approached, many families found themselves questioning choices they had made with such certainty at the beginning. The Hendersons, who had been so careful with their reserves, watched their youngest daughter grow listless and withdrawn, not from hunger, but from isolation. Maria Santos, who had shared so generously, began to worry whether her teenagers would have the strength they needed if the crisis continued much longer. The moral complexity deepened with every passing day, but something else was happening too. In their desperate attempts to navigate these impossible choices, some communities had begun to discover solutions that seemed to transcend the binary of hoarding versus sharing. Small groups were experimenting with hybrid approaches, creative systems that honored both individual security and collective responsibility. Some towns found a third way no one expected, a solution that would challenge everything they thought they knew about survival and community. But that discovery would come only after they had pushed through the darkest period yet, when the choices became even more impossible and the stakes climbed higher than anyone had imagined they could go. The solution lay in ancient knowledge, whispered from generation to generation like precious seeds carried through the harshest winters. Picture, if you will, an elderly woman in a small village, her weathered hands carefully preparing remedies that had sustained her people for centuries. These weren't mere superstitions or desperate attempts at healing. They were sophisticated systems of medicine, agriculture, and community organization that had evolved over millennia to help humans thrive in even the most challenging circumstances. As the familiar world crumbled around them, people began to remember what their ancestors had always known. The old ways weren't primitive. They were ingenious adaptations to uncertainty itself. Imagine walking through a village where every household had transformed into a center of ancient wisdom, where grandmothers became the most valuable members of society, not despite their age, but because of the knowledge they carried. In one community, an old man named Thomas, who had been dismissed as eccentric for his obsession with traditional farming methods, suddenly found himself surrounded by eager listeners. His garden, which neighbors had once mocked as old-fashioned, was now producing food when modern agricultural systems had failed. Thomas had never forgotten the companion planting techniques his grandfather taught him, the natural pest control methods that required no chemicals, the soil enrichment practices that worked with nature rather than against it. The wisdom Thomas shared wasn't just about growing food. It was about understanding the intricate relationships between plants, soil, weather, and seasons. He taught them to read the subtle signs that indicated when to plant, when to harvest, when to let the land rest. These weren't random traditions passed down through ignorance, but sophisticated observation systems developed by countless generations who had survived famines, droughts, and social upheavals. Meanwhile, across the region, other forgotten knowledge began to resurface. Women who had learned traditional food preservation from their mothers and grandmothers became teachers of vital survival skills. They demonstrated how to ferment vegetables not just for flavor, but for creating foods that could last through long winters and provide essential nutrients when fresh produce was unavailable. They showed communities how to dry meats and fish using techniques that required no modern refrigeration, how to make cheese and butter that could sustain families for months. Picture the gentle transformation taking place in countless homes. Grandmothers once again becoming teachers, their weathered hands demonstrating remedies that connected earth to healing, past to present. In rediscovering these ancient wisdoms, people found not just practical solutions, but a profound sense of coming home to themselves. But perhaps most remarkably, these communities began to rediscover the ancient art of collaborative decision-making. In villages where modern communication had failed, people naturally fell back into traditional council systems, where decisions were made through careful deliberation rather than quick votes. Elders who possessed the wisdom of experience were given the respect and authority they deserved, while younger members contributed their energy and fresh perspectives. Imagine sitting in on one of these council meetings, held perhaps in the warm glow of oil lamps when the electric lights no longer worked. The conversations weren't rushed or dominated by the loudest voices. Instead, there was a methodical process where every person's concerns were heard, where solutions were tested against the collective memory of what had worked before, where decisions were made not for immediate gratification, but for long-term community survival. These councils remembered principles that modern society had forgotten in its rush toward individual achievement. They understood that the strength of the community was more important than the success of any single person. They practiced resource sharing not out of forced charity, but because they recognized that helping others ultimately strengthened everyone's chances of survival. As these ancient practices spread from village to village, carried by travelers and refugees seeking better lives, something remarkable began to happen. People discovered that the old ways weren't just about survival. They were about creating richer, more meaningful lives. The traditional healing practices didn't just treat symptoms. They addressed the whole person, understanding the connections between physical health, emotional well-being, and spiritual balance. Communities that embraced these rediscovered traditions began to thrive in ways that surprised even their own members. Children who had grown up disconnected from nature found themselves learning to identify edible plants, to understand animal behavior, to read weather patterns in the clouds and wind. Adults who had felt powerless in the face of modern complexity discovered skills that gave them confidence and self-reliance. The barter systems that emerged weren't crude exchanges of goods, but sophisticated networks based on relationships, trust, and mutual benefit. A woman skilled in herbal medicine might trade her knowledge and remedies for assistance with building repairs. A man with woodworking abilities might craft tools in exchange for preserved foods or teaching services for his children. These weren't desperate measures born of poverty, but vibrant economic systems that valued human skills and relationships over abstract financial instruments. What made these innovations particularly powerful was their inherent resilience. Unlike modern systems that depended on complex supply chains and technological infrastructure, these traditional approaches were designed to function even when external support disappeared. They were anti-fragile. They became stronger when stressed, more robust when challenged. The leadership models that emerged from this rediscovery of ancient wisdom were particularly inspiring. Instead of authoritarian structures based on control and competition, communities developed collaborative systems where leadership was earned through service, wisdom, and the ability to build consensus. Leaders weren't distant figures making decisions from above, but integral community members who took responsibility for ensuring everyone's needs were met. These weren't idealistic fantasies, but practical systems that had been tested across centuries of human experience. They represented the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who had faced and overcome challenges that would have seemed insurmountable to modern people accustomed to technological solutions for every problem. As word of these successful communities spread, more and more people began to seek out the elders and traditional knowledge keepers in their own areas. Libraries and universities, where they still functioned, became treasure troves not just of modern information, but of historical documents describing traditional practices. People realized that the old books, the folklore, the stories their grandparents told weren't just charming relics of the past, but practical guides for creating sustainable, resilient ways of life. The transformation was profound and surprisingly rapid. Within months, communities that had seemed hopeless were flourishing with renewed purpose and confidence. They had rediscovered something that modern civilization had lost in its pursuit of efficiency and growth, the understanding that human beings are fundamentally social creatures who thrive best when they work together in harmony with natural systems. But as these innovative adaptations began to take root and spread from community to community, carried by word of mouth and demonstrated through visible success, something else was spreading alongside them. While people were learning to heal themselves with traditional remedies and to govern themselves with ancient wisdom, they were also sharing something darker, something that would soon test whether their newfound resilience could withstand challenges that even their ancestors had never fully conquered. Stories traveled faster than the plague itself. carried on the worn boots of merchants and the urgent hooves of mounted messengers. In this age, before newspapers or telegraph wires, information moved through a vast, invisible network that connected every village, every manor, every isolated farmstead across medieval Europe. Imagine, if you will, standing at the crossroads of a small market town on a crisp autumn morning. The scent of wood smoke mingles with the aroma of fresh bread from the baker's shop, and you can hear the gentle clip-clop of horses approaching from the east. These travelers carry something more precious than the finest silks or rarest spices in their saddlebags. They carry news. The medieval world was far more connected than we might imagine. While it's true that most people never ventured more than a few miles from their birthplace, information flowed constantly along well-established routes. Merchants were the arteries of this communication system, carrying not just goods, but gossip, rumors, and urgent dispatches from town to town. A piece of news that began in London could reach Paris within days, and from there spread across the continent like ripples on a still pond. But during times of crisis, this gentle flow of information became something far more urgent and dangerous. When word first spread that a terrible pestilence had struck the eastern shores, the news raced ahead of the disease itself, often distorted and magnified with each telling. A report of 100 deaths might become 1,000 by the time it reached the next village. A mysterious illness might transform into tales of divine punishment or foreign invasion. Picture a weary messenger dismounting at an inn, his horse lathered with sweat. The common room falls silent as travelers lean in to hear his urgent whispers. The sickness has reached Calais, he might say. And within hours, that news would be racing toward London, toward Amsterdam, toward every corner of the known world. But with each retelling, new details crept in. Some claimed the afflicted turned black as coal. Others whispered that entire cities lay empty, their streets patrolled only by ravens. The church played a crucial role in this information network. Monks and priests maintained correspondence across vast distances, sharing not only spiritual guidance, but practical intelligence about political upheavals, natural disasters, and emerging threats. Cathedral schools and monasteries served as communication hubs, where letters were copied and forwarded along established routes. A single piece of parchment might travel hundreds of miles, passed from abbey to abbey like a sacred relay. Yet for all its efficiency, this medieval internet was vulnerable to the same problems that plague information systems today. False reports spread just as quickly as true ones, and often proved more compelling. During times of uncertainty, people craved explanations, even impossible ones. The Black Death wasn't just a disease, it was God's wrath, or a Jewish conspiracy, or a result of corrupt air from volcanic eruptions. Each explanation found eager believers and dedicated spreaders. Consider the psychological weight of receiving such news in an age when medical understanding remained primitive. A farmer hearing that a plague was approaching might have just days to decide whether to abandon his fields and flee with his family. A merchant might need to choose between completing a profitable trade route or racing home to warn his loved ones. These weren't abstract decisions, they were matters of life and death, made with incomplete and often contradictory information. The speed of communication varied dramatically depending on the urgency of the message and the resources available. Royal couriers, riding in relay with fresh horses at every station, could cover tremendous distances in remarkably short time. During the 100 Years' War, news of major battles sometimes reached distant courts within 3 or 4 days. But for ordinary people, information moved at the pace of normal travel, roughly 20 to 30 miles per day on foot, perhaps 50 on horseback. This created a strange temporal distortion across medieval Europe. In London, people might already be implementing desperate measures against an approaching plague, while villagers a mere 100 miles away continued their daily routines in blissful ignorance. Time itself seemed to move at different speeds, with crisis racing ahead like a storm front, while normalcy lingered in its wake. The psychological impact of this uneven information flow cannot be overstated. Imagine living in a world where devastating news could arrive at any moment, carried by a stranger on the road. There was no way to verify reports immediately, no central authority to sort truth from rumor. A single false alarm could trigger mass panic and economic disruption. A delayed warning could doom entire communities. Women often played crucial but overlooked roles in these information networks. Market vendors, midwives, and travelers' wives created their own channels of communication, sharing news of family connections, economic opportunities, and emerging dangers. A midwife traveling between villages might carry word of a successful harvest or an outbreak of fever. A merchant's wife receiving a letter from distant relatives could spark rumors that spread throughout her community within hours. The system had its own internal checks and balances. Experienced travelers learned to weigh sources carefully, comparing reports from multiple messengers before making crucial decisions. Certain individuals respected merchants, learned clerks, reliable craftsmen developed reputations for accurate reporting. Their word carried more weight than that of unknown wanderers or obvious panic mongers. But even the most careful verification systems could be overwhelmed during genuine emergencies. When the Black Death finally reached Western Europe, no amount of skepticism could dismiss the mounting evidence. Town after town fell silent. Trade routes became deserted highways. The information network that had carried so many false alarms now struggled to convey the magnitude of a very real catastrophe. Religious houses often served as sanctuaries for information as well as people. Monasteries maintained detailed chronicles, recording not just local events but news from across the known world. These patient scribes created an early form of journalism, though their work might not be read for decades or centuries. Their careful records would later help historians understand how information flowed through medieval society, and how that flow could be disrupted by crisis. The technology of writing itself imposed certain limitations on medieval communication. Parchment was expensive, ink had to be mixed fresh, and every letter required painstaking labor with quill and reed. Urgent messages were often kept brief by necessity, leaving crucial details to verbal supplements that might be garbled or forgotten. Important news might arrive as cryptic fragments, requiring interpretation and imagination to fill in the gaps. As autumn deepened across the continent, the normal rhythms of seasonal communication began to shift. Traders who usually made final rounds before winter storms set in found themselves carrying increasingly desperate reports. Messages that should have been routine business correspondence took on undertones of fear and uncertainty. The approaching winter, always a time of isolation and hardship, now seemed to promise something far worse than cold and hunger. These stories would shape the fate of distant towns and remote villages, determining who would prepare for the coming storm and who would face it unprepared. The information that traveled these ancient networks carried more than news. It carried the power to save lives or doom them, to unite communities in common purpose, or scatter them in panicked flight. In the flickering candlelight of countless homes that evening, families gathered to discuss the day's news, weighing rumors against hopes, trying to divine the future from fragments of distant truth. Some towns prepared, others panicked, and in this crucial difference lay the seeds of survival or devastation. Picture, if you will, the prosperous city of Milan in the autumn of 1347. Word has reached them of a terrible plague sweeping through distant ports. The city's leaders gather in hushed chambers, candlelight flickering across their concerned faces. Unlike so many others, they do not dismiss these reports as mere rumors or distant troubles. Instead, they make a decision that will echo through history. Milan's authorities swiftly close their city gates to all travelers from affected regions. They establish strict quarantine procedures, requiring anyone entering the city to remain isolated for weeks before joining the general population. Guards patrol the walls not just for military threats, but for signs of sickness among would-be visitors. Food supplies are carefully stockpiled, and emergency protocols are put in place. Now imagine the contrast in Pisa, where merchants continue their bustling trade routes, dismissing the distant reports of plague as exaggerated tales meant to disrupt commerce. Their harbors remain open, their markets crowded, their gates welcoming to all who carry goods and coin. The city thrums with the confident energy of those who believe themselves untouchable. This divide between preparation and denial would prove prophetic. Milan's careful measures would spare them the worst of the Black Death's fury, while cities like Pisa would watch helplessly as the plague consumed their populations. But what drove some communities toward wisdom, while others embraced denial? The answer lies in something remarkably human: the power of social learning and collective memory. Towns that had experienced previous outbreaks, even of lesser diseases, possessed what we might call institutional memory. Their older residents remembered the signs, the patterns, the devastating speed with which illness could spread. These communities had learned to read the early warnings, to interpret distant reports not as abstract threats, but as urgent calls to action. Consider the town of Ragusa, nestled along the Adriatic coast. This maritime republic had weathered numerous health crises brought by merchant ships over the centuries. When news of the plague reached their ears, the town's leaders didn't hesitate. They implemented the world's first formal quarantine system, requiring ships to anchor offshore for 30 days before entering port. They called it Trentino, from the Italian word for 30. The citizens of Ragusa understood something profound: that preparation required sacrificing immediate comfort for long-term survival. Their bustling port would grow quiet, their profitable trade would slow, but their people would live to see another season. Meanwhile, in communities where prosperity had bred complacency, the very success that should have provided resources for preparation instead fostered dangerous overconfidence. Wealthy cities with strong walls and full granaries convinced themselves that their material advantages made them invulnerable to what they saw as a poor man's disease. The psychological dynamics at play were fascinating and tragic. Communities that chose preparation often had strong, unified leadership capable of making unpopular decisions quickly. They possessed what crisis researchers now call collective efficacy, the shared belief that they could work together to solve problems and protect one another. But preparation came with real costs that tested community resolve. Closing trade routes meant economic hardship. Quarantine measures separated families and disrupted social bonds. Food rationing required citizens to trust that their leaders would distribute resources fairly during times of scarcity. Some towns that began with good intentions faltered when these sacrifices became too burdensome. Citizens would demand that profitable trade resume, that restrictions be lifted, that normal life return. Leaders faced impossible choices between maintaining protective measures and preserving social cohesion. Picture a town council meeting in the French city of Avignon, already host to the papal court and accustomed to managing complex challenges. As reports of plague approach, heated debates erupt in the council chambers. Merchants argue that closing the city would cause more harm than the disease itself. Religious leaders debate whether the outbreak represents divine punishment that cannot be avoided through earthly measures. Medical practitioners, with their limited understanding, offer conflicting advice about transmission and treatment. Yet some communities found remarkable ways to balance preparation with compassion. In certain German towns, citizens organized themselves into neighborhood watches, not for crime, but for health monitoring. Families would check on one another, sharing resources while maintaining careful distance. They developed systems of care that acknowledged both the reality of contagion and the human need for connection. These prepared communities created innovations born of necessity. They developed better systems for food preservation, for waste management, for maintaining cleanliness in confined spaces. They learned to identify early symptoms and respond quickly to prevent spread. Most importantly, they maintained hope through collective action. Imagine the quiet satisfaction of neighbors working together toward common safety. The peaceful rhythm of shared tasks, the comfort of knowing that wisdom guided their actions. In choosing preparation over panic, they discovered that hope grows strongest when nurtured by many hands. The irony was stark. Towns that accepted the reality of their vulnerability often proved most resilient, while those that insisted on their invulnerability became the most fragile. Preparation required acknowledging darkness, but this acknowledgement became the foundation for light. Imagine the quiet wisdom this teaches us. That strength often comes not from denying our fears, but from facing them with clear eyes and steady hearts. In accepting what they could not control, these communities discovered what they could transform. As winter deepened across Europe in 1347, the prepared towns settled into their defensive routines. Guards maintained vigilant watches, citizens adhered to new protocols with grim determination, and leaders made daily decisions balancing caution with necessity. In these communities, people found comfort in purposeful action, in the knowledge that they were doing everything within their power to protect what they held dear. Picture the quiet strength that filled these protected spaces. Families gathering by candlelight, confident in their precautions, finding peace in their shared vigilance. There's something deeply comforting about communities united in purpose, each person contributing to the safety of all. But even in the most prepared communities, an unsettling truth was becoming clear. They could see the smoke rising from distant cities, could hear the rumors carried by the few traders they still permitted entry after quarantine. Reports spoke of entire regions falling silent, of trade routes abandoned, of the normal rhythms of medieval life grinding to a halt. The prepared towns had bought themselves time, had increased their odds of survival, had shown the power of collective wisdom over individual denial, yet they could not escape entirely the reality that was engulfing their world. Their preparation had given them the best possible chance, but chance itself remained uncertain. And as news continued to arrive from the wider world, even these wise communities began to understand that preparation alone might not be enough to stop what was coming next. The plague was not merely a challenge to be managed, but a force of nature that would test every assumption about medieval life, every structure of society, every belief about human capability and divine will. The coming winter would reveal whether wisdom and preparation could truly stand against the darkness that was spreading across the known world, or whether some forces were simply too vast, too relentless, too transformative to be contained by even the most thoughtful human response. Human nature revealed its deepest truths when no amount of preparation could shield them from what was coming. All the stockpiled supplies, all the careful planning, all the survival strategies, they could preserve the body, but they couldn't prepare the soul for what emerged when civilization's thin veneer began to crack. Yet even in these revelations about our complexity, we discover something beautiful. that beneath all our careful facades lies something essentially human that cannot be destroyed, only revealed. In crisis, we learn not just our weaknesses, but our unexpected strengths. Imagine, if you will, watching your neighbor, the man who had always nodded politely over the garden fence, suddenly standing guard over his food supplies with a shotgun. Picture the school teacher who had spent decades nurturing children's minds now calculating whether sharing her water with a stranger's child was worth the risk to her own family's survival. These weren't monsters revealing themselves. These were ordinary people discovering parts of themselves they never knew existed. The winter of 1846 showed this transformation with brutal clarity. In the Sierra Nevada mountains, as the Donner Party found themselves trapped by snow deeper than anyone had imagined possible, the veneer of social convention began to dissolve. James Reed, a businessman who had prided himself on his moral character, found himself in an argument that escalated to violence. When John Snyder raised his whip against Reed's oxen and then against Reed himself, the civilized man disappeared. In that moment of rage and desperation, Reed's knife found Snyder's heart. The aftermath revealed something even more chilling than the killing itself. How quickly the group reorganized around this new reality. Within hours, they had banished Reed from the party, sending him into the wilderness alone. His wife and children watched their protector disappear into the snow, knowing they might never see him again. The group that had started as a community of families had become something else entirely. A collection of survivors making calculations about who was worth saving and who was expendable. But it wasn't just the dramatic moments that revealed human nature's complexity. It was in the quiet decisions, the small betrayals, the tiny acts of selfishness that accumulated like snowflakes. Margaret Reed found herself hiding pieces of bread from other starving children to save for her own. William Eddy discovered he could look directly at a crying infant and feel nothing but irritation at the noise. These people weren't becoming evil. They were becoming honest about what survival really meant. The most disturbing revelation wasn't that people could become cruel under pressure. It was how natural it felt, how little internal struggle accompanied these transformations. Tamsin Donner, once a devoted schoolteacher, found herself calculating the food value of the weakest members of their group with the same clinical precision she had once used to plan lessons. The human mind, it seemed, was remarkably adaptable to circumstances that should have been unthinkable. Yet alongside these dark revelations came moments of inexplicable grace that defied all logic. While some hoarded every crumb, others continued to share even when sharing meant certain death. Margaret Reed, despite her own children's hunger, continued to comfort the orphaned Graves children. Patrick Breen, an Irish immigrant, opened his cabin to anyone who needed shelter, even as his own family's supplies dwindled to nothing. These acts of kindness weren't born from abundance or security. They emerged from the very depths of desperation. It was as if some people, when stripped of everything external, discovered an internal resource that was stronger than survival instinct itself. They made choices that made no rational sense, choices that prioritized another's welfare over their own continued existence. The psychological weight of these decisions created fractures that went deeper than physical hunger. Virginia Reed, just 13 years old, watched her father banished and her family fracture. She saw adults she had trusted make choices that revealed the arbitrary nature of moral boundaries. The child who had begun the journey believing in clear distinctions between right and wrong found herself in a world where survival itself was a moral compromise. Perhaps most haunting was how these extreme circumstances revealed the randomness of heroism and cowardice. People who had shown courage in everyday life crumbled under pressure, while others who had seemed unremarkable rose to extraordinary heights of sacrifice. There was no predicting who would break and who would bend, but not shatter. The mountain didn't care about their previous reputations, their social standing, or their personal values. It simply applied pressure and revealed what lay beneath the surface of each human soul. Some discovered well springs of resilience they never knew they possessed. Others found empty spaces where they had assumed strength resided. But even in the darkest moments, when cannibalism became not just thinkable but necessary for survival, something essentially human persisted. Those who made the ultimate taboo choice to consume human flesh did so with profound reluctance and lasting trauma. They crossed the line not because they had become monsters, but because they remained human enough to choose life over principle, love over moral purity. The tragedy wasn't that they fell short of some impossible standard of perfection. The tragedy was that these revelations about human nature came at such a devastating cost. Every insight into the human condition was paid for with suffering that marked the survivors for the rest of their lives. As we settle into our comfortable lives, with our refrigerators full and our safety taken for granted, it's easy to judge those desperate souls trapped in the mountains. But their story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. We carry within ourselves the same capacity for both transcendent goodness and shocking selfishness. The difference between us and them isn't moral superiority. It's simply that we haven't been tested at that level yet. Yet from these depths of human complexity, from this darkest valley of the soul's journey, came something unexpected. The very extremity of their circumstances created the conditions for the most beautiful expressions of human love and sacrifice. When everything external was stripped away, when survival itself hung by the thinnest thread, some discovered that their capacity to care for others wasn't diminished, but somehow purified and intensified. In the darkest hour, light found a way to break through the cracks of despair. Even as disease ravaged communities and fear gripped hearts, something beautiful began to emerge from the depths of human suffering. These were not the grand gestures that history books would remember, but the quiet acts of grace that flickered like candles in the storm. Picture, if you will, a cobblestone street in Florence, 1348. The Black Death has claimed nearly half the city's population. Bodies lie uncollected, and the living huddle behind barricaded doors. Yet in this scene of unimaginable horror, a young baker named Marco continues to leave fresh loaves outside the homes of families too sick to venture out. He asks for nothing in return. His own children have perished. His wife battles the fever. Yet every dawn finds him kneading dough by candlelight, transforming flour into hope. These moments of grace appeared everywhere, like wildflowers growing through the cracks of a shattered world. In London's plague-ridden quarters, a widowed seamstress named Eleanor discovered 3 orphaned children scavenging for scraps. Without hesitation, she opened her meager home to them, sharing her last bits of bread and wrapping them in blankets she had sewn from her deceased husband's clothes. When neighbors whispered that she was endangering herself, Eleanor simply smiled and said, "If we lose our humanity to save our lives, what have we truly saved?" Imagine the scene in a monastery outside Paris, where Brother Thomas found himself alone after his fellow monks had fled or fallen to disease. The surrounding villages looked to the monastery for guidance, but Thomas possessed no special wisdom about healing. What he did have was an abundance of compassion. Each morning, he would walk among the sick, not offering false promises of recovery, but simply sitting with those who were dying, holding their hands, speaking gentle words, ensuring that no soul would depart this world feeling abandoned. The most remarkable acts of grace often came from those who had the least to give. In a small German village, an elderly woman known only as Greta had watched the plague take her entire family. Her neighbors expected her to retreat into grief, perhaps even welcome death herself. Instead, Greta began making rounds to every remaining household, carrying with her a small pot of soup made from whatever vegetables and herbs she could gather. The soup itself was meager, but the warmth of human connection it represented was immeasurable. Consider the story of a physician in Venice, Dr. Benedetto, who had lost his medical books and most of his instruments to looters. He could have retreated to safety in the countryside, as many of his colleagues had done. Instead, he remained in the city, tending to the sick with nothing but his hands and his presence. When asked why he stayed when he could offer so little medical intervention, he replied, "Sometimes the most powerful medicine is the knowledge that someone cares enough to stay." Picture the gentle comfort this brought to families watching their loved ones suffer. In the midst of such devastating loss, Dr. Benedetto's presence became like a warm candle in a cold room. Small perhaps, but casting light that reached into every corner of despair. These acts of grace extended beyond individual kindness to transform entire communities. In one plague-ravaged town in England, the surviving residents made an extraordinary decision. Rather than hoarding the few remaining resources, they established a common kitchen where everyone, regardless of their former social status, would share whatever food could be found. Lords and servants sat side by side, breaking bread together in a way that would have been unthinkable before the plague. The disease had stripped away artificial barriers, revealing the fundamental equality of human suffering and human dignity. Perhaps most moving were the anonymous gifts that appeared during the darkest days. In countless cities across Europe, residents would wake to find small offerings left at their doorsteps. A jar of honey, a warm cloak, a handful of dried fruit, a carved wooden toy for a grieving child. No one ever claimed credit for these gifts. They appeared like morning dew, evidence of some inexplicable goodness that persisted even when hope seemed lost. The plague years revealed that within the human heart lies an inexhaustible capacity for grace. Even when stripped of everything familiar and comforting, people found ways to reach beyond their own suffering to touch another's pain with tenderness. A mother who had lost her own children would rock a stranger's crying infant. A merchant who had lost his fortune would share his last coin with a beggar. A priest who had lost his faith would still offer last rites to the dying, because the ritual itself had become an act of love rather than religious duty. These were not calculated acts of heroism, but spontaneous expressions of our deepest nature. In moments when survival instinct might have demanded selfishness, countless individuals chose instead to embody grace. They fed the hungry when they themselves were starving. They comforted the dying when they themselves were terrified. They offered hope when they themselves despaired. The beautiful paradox of these plague years was that while disease reduced the population, it somehow expanded the soul. Faced with the stark reality of mortality, people discovered what truly mattered. The artificial divisions that had once seemed so important, wealth, status, education, melted away like snow in spring rain. What remained was the irreducible core of human worth and the irrepressible impulse to care for one another. In monasteries and cottages, in palaces and peasant huts, the same story repeated itself. When everything else had been stripped away, love remained. When every comfort had been lost, kindness endured. When death seemed to have the final word, grace spoke louder. Picture a quiet evening in one of these plague-touched communities. The sun sets through windows of homes where families gather closer now, having learned the precious fragility of each moment together. Children who have witnessed unimaginable loss nevertheless play gentle games. Adults who have survived the unthinkable share simple meals with profound gratitude. And somewhere in the gathering dusk, someone is still performing a small act of kindness. Reading to an elderly neighbor, mending clothes for a widowed friend, or simply offering a listening ear to someone who needs to speak their grief into the darkness. These acts would echo through generations, becoming the foundation stories that communities would tell their children. They would remember not just the horror of the plague years, but the extraordinary grace that emerged from that horror. They would understand that in humanity's darkest hours, we are capable of our most luminous responses. The light that shines brightest is often the one that glows in the deepest darkness. These acts of grace would become seeds planted in the ashes of devastation, seeds that would bloom into new forms of compassion, new institutions of care, new ways of understanding our responsibility to one another. The plague would end, but the memory of grace would endure, passed down like a precious inheritance from one generation to the next. Proof that no darkness is so complete that love cannot find a way through. The towns that survived were forever changed, their very foundations reshaped by the lessons written in loss. Picture, if you will, a small community emerging from winter's grip, but not the same village that had huddled together in fear just seasons before. These were places that had learned to breathe differently, to organize themselves around new truths about survival and human connection. In Bristol, where the merchant families had once hoarded grain while others starved, a remarkable transformation took root. The survivors established what they called community stores, shared granaries where families contributed what they could and took only what they needed. Margaret Thornley, a baker's widow who had lost her husband and 2 sons, became the keeper of these stores. She would rise each morning before dawn, not to bake bread for profit as her husband once had, but to ensure that no child in their community would wake to an empty stomach again. Imagine the quiet revolution in these simple acts. The very spaces where people gathered were reimagined. Town squares that had once been places for merchants to hawk their wares became communal kitchens during times of scarcity. Churches opened their doors not just for Sunday worship, but as daily sanctuaries where the grieving could find solace and the practical work of survival could continue. The plague had taught them that isolation meant death, but connection meant life. In York, the surviving guildmasters broke with centuries of tradition. Where once apprenticeships had been jealously guarded, family inheritances, they began teaching anyone willing to learn. William Carpenter, who had lost his 3 sons, took in orphaned children not as free labor, but as the continuation of knowledge that might otherwise die with him. Picture these new social contracts being written not in formal documents, but in daily gestures of interdependence. When Eleanor Walsh's roof collapsed under winter snow, it wasn't just her neighbors who appeared with tools and timber. It was people from across the social spectrum who had learned that community resilience depended on everyone's well-being. The blacksmith worked alongside the former Lord Steward, and children who had been born into different classes played together while their parents rebuilt what had been broken. These towns developed what we might call memorial practices, rituals of remembrance that shaped their daily lives. In Cambridge, they planted a grove of apple trees, one for each family lost to the plague. But these weren't just monuments to the dead. They were living reminders of abundance that required tending. Every spring, as the trees bloomed, the survivors would gather to tell stories of those they'd lost while planning for the harvests to come. The most profound changes weren't just social, but deeply institutional. Town councils that had once been the exclusive domain of wealthy merchants began including voices that would have been unthinkable before the catastrophe. Sarah Millwright, a woman who had managed her deceased husband's grain mill through the worst of the plague, found herself consulted on matters far beyond commerce. Her practical knowledge of food distribution and resource management had proven more valuable than any noble lineage. Imagine the quiet strength that emerged from these new arrangements. Where once there had been rigid hierarchies based on birth and wealth, necessity had created networks based on competence and contribution. The young lord who had inherited his father's estate but knew nothing of farming worked alongside elderly peasants who understood the land's moods and seasons. Knowledge flowed in directions that would have scandalized the previous generation. These communities developed new ways of making decisions too. Instead of proclamations from above, they evolved systems of consultation that honored different kinds of wisdom. When drought threatened crops, they didn't wait for distant authorities to respond. They gathered in circles, farmers, mothers, craftsmen, even children who had observed patterns the adults missed, and planned together for survival and abundance. The winter markets transformed as well. Where scarcity had once driven prices beyond reach, these recovered communities created systems of exchange that ensured everyone could participate. They developed what might be called resilience currencies. Labor exchanges where time and skill mattered as much as silver coin. An elderly woman's knowledge of healing herbs could trade for a young man's strength in hauling timber, creating webs of mutual dependence that strengthened the whole community. Picture the quiet ceremonies that marked these transformations. Each Sunday, after regular worship, the communities would hold what they called remembrance councils, gatherings where they would speak aloud the names of those they'd lost, but also celebrate the skills and wisdom that had emerged from their trials. These weren't mournful occasions, but affirmations of life continuing, growing stronger through memory and adaptation. The children born into these transformed communities grew up with different assumptions about how human societies could function. They saw cooperation as natural, leadership as service, and abundance as something to be shared rather than hoarded. Young Thomas Baker, born 3 years after the plague's end, would grow up assuming that every family in town had a say in important decisions, that resources were meant to circulate for everyone's benefit, and that strength came from the health of the whole community. These recovered towns became laboratories of human possibility, though their inhabitants wouldn't have used such grand terms. They were simply people who had faced the ultimate test of survival, and discovered that their old ways of organizing society had been both fragile and unnecessarily cruel. They rebuilt not just their buildings and their economies, but their fundamental relationships with each other. The ripple effects extended beyond their own borders. Merchants traveling between these communities carried stories of how differently things could be done. A trader who visited both the transformed Bristol and unchanged London would return home with questions about why his own community accepted so much unnecessary suffering when alternatives existed just a day's journey away. Imagine the quiet confidence that emerged from these experiments in living differently. These weren't perfect societies. They still faced conflicts, still struggled with human nature's complexities. But they had proven that communities could reorganize themselves around care rather than competition, around shared abundance rather than individual accumulation. The architectural changes told their own stories. Houses built after the plague included common spaces that earlier generations would have found strange. Shared workshops where neighbors could work together, communal gardens that belonged to no single family but fed many, and meeting halls designed not for proclamations from authority, but for circles of conversation and shared decision-making. Imagine walking through these transformed neighborhoods, the gentle hum of shared labor from workshops, the sight of children playing in gardens tended by many loving hands, the warm glow of meeting halls where every voice matters. These weren't just buildings. They were monuments to the unbreakable human spirit. But the most important changes were invisible, written in the daily rhythms of how people related to each other, how they made decisions, how they defined success and safety. These transformations would echo through generations, shaping the assumptions and possibilities that their children would inherit. The deepest changes lived in memory and habit, passed from grandmother to granddaughter in the quiet spaces between words. While governments and armies fought their visible wars, the real transformation was happening around hearth fires and in hushed conversations, where women shared what they had learned about surviving the unthinkable. Picture, if you will, an elderly woman in a dimly lit cottage, her weathered hands working steadily at her mending while she speaks to her daughter-in-law. Her voice carries the weight of experience as she shares not just recipes and remedies, but the deeper wisdom of reading danger signs, of knowing when to hide food and when to share it, of understanding the delicate balance between trust and caution that had kept her family alive through the darkest times. These conversations were happening in every home, in every village, as the women who had lived through the worst began to weave their hard-won knowledge into the fabric of daily life. They didn't speak of strategy or politics. Instead, they taught practical wisdom: how to preserve food for longer than anyone thought possible, how to read the subtle signs that predicted community troubles, how to maintain hope when hope seemed foolish. The children listening to these stories absorbed more than survival skills. They learned a new way of seeing the world, one that understood that safety was always temporary, that community bonds were more valuable than individual wealth, and that the ability to adapt quickly was the difference between thriving and merely surviving. These weren't lessons you could find in any book. They were insights burned into memory through lived experience. In the villages, women began establishing what we might now call informal networks of mutual aid, though they would have simply called it neighborliness. When Sarah's husband fell ill, the other women in the village didn't just bring soup. They brought a coordinated system of support that ensured her children were fed, her animals tended, and her fields managed until he recovered. This wasn't charity. It was an investment in the collective resilience of the community. The rituals, too, were changing in subtle but profound ways. The harvest festivals still celebrated abundance, but now they also included ceremonies of gratitude for survival, acknowledgments of loss, and renewed commitments to watching out for one another. The winter gatherings became opportunities not just for entertainment, but for sharing knowledge about weathering hardship, both literal and metaphorical. Religious practices evolved to incorporate this new understanding of fragility and interdependence. Prayers that had once focused on individual salvation now emphasized community strength. Sermons spoke not just of eternal rewards, but of the sacred duty to care for one another in this life. The concept of providence expanded to include the idea that divine protection worked through human hands and hearts. Perhaps most importantly, the ways people talked about the future changed. Where previous generations had planned with confidence, assuming that tomorrow would largely resemble today, these survivors developed a different relationship with uncertainty. They began teaching their children to hold plans lightly, to always have alternatives, and to find stability not in external circumstances, but in their connections to others and their own adaptability. The stories they told their children reflected this shift. Instead of fairy tales about brave princes conquering evil through strength, they shared stories about clever communities surviving through cooperation. Heroes weren't necessarily the strongest or the boldest. They were the ones who could read situations accurately, who could bring people together, who could find solutions that nobody had thought of before. This emerging wisdom wasn't written down in any formal way. It lived in the space between words, in the way mothers paused before answering certain questions, in the particular emphasis they placed on certain lessons. Children learned to pay attention not just to what was said, but to what wasn't said, to the weight of silence that surrounded certain topics. The protective customs that developed weren't dramatic or obvious. They were woven into the ordinary rhythms of life. The way women would casually check on each other's families, the way information about strangers was quietly shared through informal channels, the way resources were distributed to ensure that no household fell too far behind the others. These practices created a web of awareness and mutual support that was nearly invisible to outsiders, but absolutely essential to the community's well-being. As seasons passed, this collective wisdom began to take on its own momentum. What had started as individual responses to crisis gradually became community traditions. The knowledge that had been hard-won through suffering became the foundation for a more resilient way of life. People discovered that the skills they had developed for surviving trauma also made them better at preventing it, better at building the kind of communities where such traumas were less likely to occur. Picture the gentle rhythm of this transformation. Wisdom passing from hand to hand like a precious flame, each person adding their own understanding while keeping the essential light alive. In this way, suffering became a teacher, and survival became an art form. The oral traditions that emerged carried not just information, but emotional wisdom about how to process difficult experiences, how to maintain hope during dark times, and how to find meaning in suffering without being destroyed by it. These stories became a form of collective therapy, helping each new generation understand that they weren't the first to face impossible challenges, and that survival was not just possible, but could lead to something better than what came before. Children growing up in this environment learned resilience not as a personal quality to be developed in isolation, but as a community capacity that was maintained through constant attention to relationships, to shared resources, and to the subtle signs that indicated when intervention was needed. They understood that individual strength was important, but community strength was essential. This wisdom would guide them through future storms, not because it provided easy answers, but because it had taught them how to think about problems differently, how to see opportunities for cooperation where others might see only competition, and how to find hope in the very human capacity to adapt, to care for one another, and to create something beautiful, even in the midst of uncertainty. And so we arrive at the heart of what these distant voices whisper across centuries. Their legacy reaches across 5 centuries to touch us today, like light from distant stars that continues to illuminate our path long after its source has passed. Tonight, we've traced together how the Black Death revealed something profound about human nature, that even in our darkest hours, we possess an unbreakable capacity for resilience, adaptation, and grace. Think about this for a moment. Every time modern society faces a pandemic, an economic collapse, or widespread social upheaval, we unconsciously draw upon lessons learned in those plague years. The quarantine systems developed in Venice in 1348, they became the blueprint for every isolation protocol we've used since, including those implemented just a few years ago. The economic principles of debt forgiveness and labor mobility that emerged from necessity, they're still debated in economic forums today. The Black Death taught humanity something profound about resilience. It showed us that even when everything familiar crumbles, even when half the people we know disappear, even when the very fabric of society tears apart, something essential in the human spirit endures. More than endures, actually. It adapts, it innovates, it rebuilds. Imagine walking through a modern city today and really seeing it with plague-informed eyes. Those wide boulevards that allow for better air circulation? That urban planning principle emerged from miasma theory, born in plague-ravaged cities. The public health departments that monitor disease outbreaks, direct descendants of the plague boards established in Italian cities. Even something as simple as the practice of washing hands regularly, now so embedded in our culture that children learn it as naturally as walking, traces its widespread adoption to lessons learned during those terrible years. But perhaps most remarkably, the Black Death taught us about human connection. When death was everywhere, when isolation was necessary for survival, people discovered that their bonds to one another were not weakened by physical distance, but strengthened by shared purpose. Medieval communities learned to care for each other across quarantine barriers. They developed systems of mutual aid that transcended family lines and social classes. They created rituals of remembrance that honored the dead while affirming the commitment of the living to carry on. These are not just historical curiosities. These are living principles that guide us still. Every time a natural disaster strikes and neighbors help neighbors they've never spoken to before, we're seeing plague-era mutual aid in action. Every time a community rallies around its vulnerable members during a crisis, we're witnessing the unbreakable human spirit that first fully revealed itself in those dark medieval years. The survivors of the Black Death gave us something invaluable. Proof that humanity can endure anything. Not just survive it, but emerge from it more compassionate, more innovative, more deeply connected to what truly matters. They showed us that when everything we thought was permanent proves to be temporary, what remains is our capacity to care for one another and to build something better from the ruins. Consider the stories we've traced tonight. Willem and his family, finding strength in tradition while adapting to unprecedented change. Isabella, transforming personal loss into community healing. The nameless thousands who chose kindness over fear, who shared their last meal with strangers, who died helping others live. Their courage becomes our courage. Their wisdom becomes our wisdom. Their hope becomes our hope. This is what we've discovered together tonight. What legacy truly means. Not just the institutions and practices they left behind, though those matter enormously. Not just the economic and social structures they rebuilt, though those transformed the world. The deepest legacy is the knowledge, passed down through 5 centuries, that human beings can face the unthinkable, and not just endure it, but transform it into something beautiful. You came here tonight seeking stories of resilience, and found something even more precious. Proof that the same strength that carried our ancestors through their impossible trials lives within you right now. In our own age of uncertainty, when the news feels overwhelming and the future seems unclear, we can draw comfort from this knowledge. The same resilience that carried medieval Europeans through their darkest hours flows in our veins. The same capacity for innovation, for adaptation, for mutual care that rebuilt their world is available to us in rebuilding ours. The Black Death taught us that crisis, however devastating, is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new chapter. And in that new chapter, written by ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, we discover again and again that the human spirit is truly unbreakable. As you settle into sleep tonight, carry with you this quiet confidence. You are the descendant of survivors. In your very existence, you embody their triumph over impossible odds. In your capacity for kindness, you continue their legacy of mutual care. In your ability to adapt and innovate, you carry forward their gift for transformation. Perhaps in the gentle moments before sleep takes you, you might reflect on the communities in your own life, the connections that anchor you, the small acts of grace you witness daily, the quiet strength you've discovered in yourself during difficult times. The cozy corner of history we've explored together tonight reminds us that even in the darkest times, human beings find ways to create light. Even when everything familiar disappears, we discover that what truly matters was always within us. Even when the future seems uncertain, we can trust in the proven resilience of the human heart. Let their courage strengthen you. Let their wisdom guide you. Let their hope illuminate your dreams. The survivors of the Black Death would want you to know that whatever challenges you face, you have within you everything needed to meet them. Their legacy is not just in the history books, but in your own unbreakable spirit. Sleep well tonight, dear listener, wrapped in the comfort of this ancient wisdom. Rest in the knowledge that you are part of an unbroken chain of human resilience that stretches back through the centuries and will continue long into the future. The light of their courage burns on in you,